The hum of Arboria-7 was a constant companion, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck plates and settled deep in my bones. It was the sound of my solitude, a lullaby of isolation. For 3 years, this deep space research outpost had been my world, a metal shell against the indifferent vacuum, and I, Reid Blake, its lone xenobotanist, had charted every known fungal bloom, every crystalline lichen, every hardy pioneer organism clinging to this desolate rock. My days unfolded in a precise rhythm: environmental scans, nutrient calibrations, tissue cultures under the sterile glow of the lab. My determination was a shield against the crushing silence that often threatened to seep in through the viewport, where distant nebulae spun like smeared paint. This morning, however, the routine felt different. A geological survey, decades old and tucked away in an obscure data archive, had flagged a thermal anomaly in a segment of the planet's vast subterranean network, a volcanic cave system, previously dismissed as geologically unstable and biologically sterile. Most dismissed the data as sensor ghosting, but something about the persistence of the old thermal readings, buried deep within layers of atmospheric interference, snagged at my professional intuition. My gut, honed by years of sifting through false positives and dead ends, told me it warranted a closer look. I geared up methodically, the heavy boots clanking against the metal grid of the airlock. The environmental suit felt like a second skin, its internal climate control a welcome contrast to the oppressive heat I knew awaited me. My pack was light, stocked with core sampling tools, biocontainment units, and a compact spectral analyzer. The journey to the cave entrance was brief, a short trek across the rust-colored regolith, the sun of this distant system a fierce bronze coin in the sky. The entrance to the volcanic cave system gaped like a wound in the planet's crust, exhaling plumes of sulfurous steam that tasted metallic on my recirculated air. I activated my headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. The air grew thick, hot, and heavy with the smell of wet rock and ozone. My comms crackled with static, a reminder of the outpost's increasingly distant presence. I was on my own, just as I preferred. The descent was slow, deliberate. The floor was a treacherous mix of loose scree and solidified magma flows, jagged obsidian teeth waiting to tear at my suit. Every sound echoed, magnified, the scrape of my boots, the hiss of the steam vents, the ragged cadence of my own breathing. I moved deeper, past stalactites of solidified ash and shimmering mineral deposits, the raw geology a testament to the planet's violent birth. The thermal readings on my wrist-mounted scanner climbed steadily, confirming the old data. This wasn't just heat. It was active geothermal activity. Then a shift. The air, already thick, grew stiller, the sounds of the active vents muffled by an unseen geological barrier. My headlamp beam, usually so definitive, seemed to diffuse into the surrounding atmosphere, creating an odd, luminous haze. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it pricked at my senses. I paused, scanning the environment. Nothing. I continued, round a bend in the cavern, and my breath hitched. There it was. Not a forest, not a field, but a single, isolated specimen. It grew from a fissure in the obsidian floor, a vibrant, impossible splash of emerald and amethyst against the dull, charcoal backdrop. It was unlike anything I had ever cataloged, anything I had ever seen in any database, terrestrial or xenobotanical. The plant was roughly the size of a human torso, its form a complex fractal geometry of interwoven tendrils and broad, translucent leaves that pulsed with a soft internal luminescence. My scanner, usually so precise, sputtered. Its readings flickered wildly, unable to categorize the specimen. No known carbon-based compounds registered, no familiar photosynthetic signatures. It was an anomaly, a biological impossibility thriving in an environment that should have rendered it inert. The leaves, thin as membrane, seemed to ripple even in the absence of a breeze, as if breathing with an imperceptible rhythm. A faint, almost imperceptible scent wafted from it, a sweet, cloying aroma that carried a strange undertone of something metallic, like ancient rust and ozone. I approached cautiously, my scientific curiosity overriding any nascent trepidation. This was it. The reason I had spent years staring at microscans, the reward for every lonely hour. This was a discovery that would rewrite textbooks. I knelt, my gloved hand hovering inches from a shimmering frond. The plant pulsed, and for a fleeting instant I felt a faint resonance, a sympathetic vibration deep within my own chest. It was probably just the geological activity, a delayed thermal wave. I extended a sterile sampling tool, my movements precise, methodical. The frond yielded easily, detaching with a faint, almost musical snick. It felt strangely warm in my gloved hand, supple yet resilient. The severed end immediately began to glow brighter, then sealed itself, leaving no scar on the parent plant. My spectral analyzer finally registered something, an unidentifiable energy signature, complex and utterly alien, radiating from the tissue. My mind raced, hypotheses colliding. A non-silicate life form, a radically different biochemistry. The implications were enormous. I carefully placed the sample into a biocontainment unit, sealing it with a snap. My gaze returned to the parent plant, its impossible luminescence now seeming to throb with a deeper, more insistent rhythm. It was magnificent. It was utterly baffling. The tension in the air was no longer just from the volcanic heat. It was something else entirely, an electric charge born of profound discovery. I had found it. The anomaly. The low thrum of Arboria-7, my constant companion, intensified as I navigated the winding tunnels beneath the outpost. The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur and minerals, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled atmosphere of my living quarters. My headlamp cut a stark beam through the gloom, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the volcanic cave system, a labyrinth of ancient igneous rock that had become my temporary field site. The specimen, nestled carefully within its reinforced biocontainment module, radiated a faint, almost imperceptible warmth against my gloved hand. It was heavier than it looked, denser, like solidified starlight. Securing it had been a delicate operation. Its root system, if I could even call it that, had woven itself into the very rock, not merely adhering, but seemingly fusing with the basalt. I'd used an ultrasonic blade not to cut, but to gently vibrate the surrounding matrix until the specimen released its hold with a soft, almost sighing sound. Even now, the memory of that sound prickled at the back of my neck. It was too organic, too deliberate. The journey back to my primary laboratory was a solitary one, as always. The heavy-duty transport cart rumbled over the uneven terrain, its treads kicking up fine volcanic dust. I kept glancing back at the containment module, a block of transparent composite material that now held the most extraordinary discovery of my career. My mind raced, cataloging potential analyses, imagining the papers I'd write. This was it. This was the breakthrough I'd spent 3 years in this metal shell, light years from anything familiar, waiting for. Once inside the lab, the sterile environment felt almost welcoming after the primeval dampness of the caves. I carefully transferred the module to the central analysis bay, a circular platform designed for detailed botanical study. The module's internal climate controls hummed to life, maintaining the precise atmospheric conditions I'd recorded in the volcanic cave system. I ran through the preliminary scans, a battery of non-invasive spectral analyses, thermal imaging, and molecular resonance tests. Everything came back, anomalous, not incorrect, just outside any known parameters. The first oddity manifested within hours. I'd stepped away for a nutrient paste and a brief, solitary moment of quiet reflection, then returned to check the initial growth projections. The specimen, a cluster of crystalline filaments that resembled spun glass, had visibly elongated, not by micrometers but by full millimeters. I blinked, leaning closer to the magnified display. Impossible. No known flora could grow at such a rate, especially not without a direct nutrient source beyond the trace elements in its sealed environment. I recalibrated the growth sensors, double-checked the timestamps. The data was unequivocal. A segment of the central filament had extended by 7 millimeters in the span of 17 minutes. A novel metabolic pathway, I murmured, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet lab. Extremely efficient. Perhaps it's drawing energy from ambient radiation, or even. I trailed off, unwilling to entertain the more outlandish possibilities. My scientific training demanded a rational explanation. It was just a plant, albeit an extraordinary one. As the day wore on, the growth continued, not in a uniform, predictable manner, but in sudden, almost jerky bursts. A new filament would sprout from a seemingly smooth surface, then another, twisting and intertwining with its predecessors in intricate, non-repeating patterns. It was like watching a time-lapse video in real time. The patterns weren't chaotic. They possessed an underlying geometry that defied simple fractal models, too complex, too deliberate. Then came the light. Faint at first, a barely there luminescence emanating from the very core of the specimen. It wasn't a steady glow, but a pulse, a soft, rhythmic throb that seemed to mirror my own heartbeat. I dimmed the lab's overhead lights, plunging the room into near darkness save for the gentle hum of equipment. The bioluminescent auras became more distinct, shifting through hues of pale sapphire and deep amethyst, tracing the newly formed filaments. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but also unsettling. The light felt internal, a manifestation of some deep, unseen process. It was too soft, too alive for a mere chemical reaction. I found myself staring, mesmerized, for what felt like an eternity. The rhythmic pulsing seemed to sync with my breathing, a slow, hypnotic cadence. It was then in that quiet, dimly lit space that I felt it, a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible psychic resonance. It wasn't a sound, not a thought, but a presence. A feeling of being observed, not by an external entity, but from within the specimen itself. It was like a cold tendril of curiosity brushing against the edge of my consciousness, a whisper of something vast and utterly alien. I shook my head, a sharp, deliberate movement. Fatigue, that was it. The long hours in the volcanic cave system, the adrenaline of discovery, the relentless isolation of Arboria-7. My mind was playing tricks on me. The light was just an unusual form of photoluminescence, and the growth patterns, while unique, would undoubtedly yield to further analysis. As for the presence, that was pure exhaustion, a symptom of being alone for too long. My determination, my scientific rigor, demanded I dismiss such fanciful notions. This was a plant. A remarkable, unprecedented plant, but a plant nonetheless. It was a new frontier for xenobotany, nothing more. My headlamp cut a stark beam through the gloom, illuminating jagged basalt formations that glinted wetly in the oppressive heat. Each step echoed, a hollow sound swallowed quickly by the vastness of the volcanic cave system. Steam hissed from fissures in the rock, obscuring my vision in momentary, scalding clouds, forcing me to pause, my breath catching in the hot, heavy air. I pressed deeper, following the faint energy signature I'd detected, a resonance unlike anything terrestrial. The determination to understand propelled, overriding the exhaustion that gnawed at my bones. This wasn't just a new specimen, it felt like a door. A door to something profound, something that hummed with an ancient, silent power. The passage narrowed, forcing me to squeeze between two towering pillars of obsidian, their surfaces slick with mineral runoff. On the other side, the air grew stiller, the heat less suffocating, replaced by a strange, almost metallic coolness. My headlamp beam swept across a vast, cavernous chamber, and there it was. Sprouting from a fissure in the cavern floor, a cluster of crystalline stalks shimmered, catching the light in impossible ways. They weren't green or brown or any color I could name. Instead, they seemed to absorb and refract light, manifesting hues that shifted and rippled like liquid aurora. Tendrils, delicate as spun glass, unfurled from the central cluster, reaching towards the cavern ceiling, almost transparent. This was the source of the anomaly, the impossible flora. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on loose scree. The specimen pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, a soft, rhythmic glow that seemed to breathe. As I leaned closer, a subtle, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the rock beneath my feet, resonating deep within my chest. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a pressure. I extended a gloved hand, careful not to touch it, observing the way the air around its delicate tendrils seemed to warp, blurring the cavern walls behind it. This was the reveal/discovery. The plant didn't just grow, it subtly bent the fabric of perception around itself. My mind reeled with the implications. Carefully, meticulously, I harvested a small sample, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. I placed it in a shielded containment field, the specimen continuing its silent, luminous pulse within the reinforced glass. Back in the sterile confines of my lab, the specimen rested under the focused beam of the spectral analyzer. Its crystalline structure defied every known botanical classification. No cells, no chlorophyll, no discernible roots in the traditional sense. It seemed to simply be a nexus of pure, shifting light. I spent hours cataloging its properties, running diagnostics, cross-referencing against the entire xenobotanical database, all to no avail. It was an anomaly without precedent. As the cycles of the outpost's artificial day-night faded into what felt like an endless twilight, I began to notice things. Small things at first. I'd whip my head around, but nothing. Just the familiar hum of the life support systems, the gentle whir of the centrifuges. Sleep deprivation, I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. That's all it is. Too many hours staring at a screen. But the glitches persisted. While poring over the specimen's crystalline structure under the electron microscope, the fine lines of its surface seemed to momentarily shift, forming intricate, fleeting patterns that dissolved as soon as I tried to focus. Faint, almost inaudible like static on an old comms channel just below the threshold of comprehension. They were never distinct, never formed words, merely a breathy murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the lab. I paused my work, straining my ears. Nothing, only the consistent, reassuring drone of the outpost. I shook my head, pushing a hand through my hair. Isolation getting to me, I rationalized aloud, the sound of my own voice a stark, lonely thing in the quiet lab. It's just the pressure. This discovery. The specimen contained within its field seemed to pulse with a more insistent light, almost as if it were responding to my growing agitation. I found myself glancing at it more often, a prickle on the back of my neck suggesting I was being watched, even though I was undeniably alone. I tried to focus on the data, the objective measurements, to anchor myself in the tangible. My peripheral vision darted, catching phantom movements, streaks of impossible color that vanished before I could truly register them. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was something else, but what? My mind, trained in logic and scientific rigor, fought against the rising tide of irrationality. It had to be stress. The sheer weight of my isolation, the monumental nature of the discovery, the lack of proper rest. I needed to push through this. I needed to understand the specimen. That was my purpose. That was all that mattered. I clenched my jaw, forcing my gaze back to the readouts, determined to ignore the subtle shifts that were beginning to unravel the edges of my reality. The sterile white walls of the lab, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, too bright, too stark. The specimen contained within its field seemed to pulse with a more insistent light, almost as if it were breathing. My unease had solidified into a cold, hard knot in my gut, pressing against my diaphragm, making each breath a conscious effort. I found myself leaning closer to the containment field, my face almost touching the cool barrier, trying to decipher the subtle shifts in its luminescence. It had been only a few hours since my last detailed observation, but the changes were undeniable, startling. What had been a delicate, shimmering network of filaments was now a dense, intricate latticework. It wasn't merely growing, it was building. Tendrils, no longer simple, had begun to intertwine, forming rigid, angular structures that defied every botanical principle I knew. They weren't cells dividing and expanding. They were constructs assembling themselves with a horrifying precision. Sharp, crystalline spikes, almost translucent, jutted out from the core, catching the lab lights and refracting them into a myriad of shifting colors that seemed to bleed into the air around them. My recording instruments buzzed softly, documenting the impossible. The growth rate was exponential, a furious, silent expansion that made a mockery of every growth curve I'd ever plotted. The biomass was increasing without any discernible nutrient input, pulling energy from somewhere. Then came the sound. It wasn't a vocalization in any sense I understood, but a subtle resonance, a low thrumming that vibrated not in my ears, but directly behind my eyes at the base of my skull. It started as a faint tremor, easily dismissed as the hum of the facility's life support, but it sharpened, gaining a distinct rhythm, a pulse that matched the insistent glow of the specimen. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space, filling my head. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to push it out, but it was already inside. It wasn't language, not yet, but it felt like a presence, a directed energy. I stumbled back from the field, needing distance, needing air that didn't feel thick with unseen vibration. My determination, usually a steadfast companion, was fraying at the edges. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an intrusion. The sheer audacity of its existence, its blatant disregard for physics and biology, chipped away at the foundations of my understanding, leaving me exposed to something utterly unknown. Sleep became a battlefield. They were less like sounds and more like raw data, a flood of non-verbal information that my mind struggled to process. They painted pictures, not with light but with an internal pressure that formed images behind my closed eyelids. I found myself perpetually in a dream of a vast, echoing space. It was a volcanic cave system, immense and ancient, its walls slick with a shimmering obsidian sheen. The ground beneath my feet was a jagged tapestry of cooled lava, treacherous and unforgiving. And everywhere in the deepest recesses, emanating from cracks and fissures, was the same impossible light that pulsed from the specimen in my lab. They weren't words, but complex, layered harmonies that twisted and coiled, suggesting patterns, immense structures, and an intelligence that spanned epochs. And from that chasm, the plant, or something like it, would begin to rise, its impossible, crystalline structures reaching for me, beckoning me into the light. The fear wasn't of falling, but of understanding. The distinction between the lab, the specimen, and the nightmares blurred. Had I been to that cave? Was it real? Or was it a construct planted in my mind by the thing growing in the containment field? Back in the lab, the growth continued, relentless. The crystalline structures were no longer mere spikes. They were forming intricate lattice-like networks that resembled complex neural pathways, pulsing with that internal, rhythmic light. Parts of the specimen now seemed to glow with a dull, inner fire, a deep orange that reminded me too vividly of the molten core of the Earth, or the glow from the chasm in my nightmares. I spent my waking hours hunched over the monitors, charting its impossible progress, my hand shaking as I updated the logs. My mind, once a fortress of scientific inquiry, felt porous, susceptible. The specimen was not just growing, it was evolving at a rate that defied every natural law, and in doing so it was subtly, horrifyingly, evolving me. I felt its presence not just as an object of study, but as a vast, silent intellect, slowly, patiently, unraveling the threads of my reality, one impossible whisper at a time. The outpost, once a sanctuary of science, now felt like a cage, shrinking with every beat of that alien pulse. The last tendril of that impossible whisper seemed to unspool from my skull, leaving behind a hollow echo. I still felt it, a faint, resonant hum deep behind my eyes, a sensation like a tuning fork vibrating against bone. It wasn't a sound I could replicate, nor a thought I could articulate, but its presence was undeniable, a cold, vast intelligence attempting to coil itself around the fragile core of my consciousness. I stood within the research section, a massive containment chamber meticulously engineered to replicate the hostile, nutrient-rich conditions of its discovery. This was our simulated volcanic cave system, a realm of perpetual twilight and searing humidity, where the air hung thick with mineral aerosols. Jagged, artificial rock formations, crafted from silicate composites, rose around me, stained with the ochre and rust hues of real volcanic deposits. Beneath my boots, the grated floor vibrated with the low thrum of environmental controls, maintaining the precise atmospheric pressure and temperature required for the specimen to thrive. And thrive it did. It had expanded exponentially since I last measured it, its tendrils now reaching with impossible speed towards the humid air scrubbers high above. The growth was beyond any known botanical classification, a relentless, almost aggressive expansion that defied the very laws of cellular division I understood. My instruments confirmed the acceleration, charting an upward curve that looked more like a line graph of a collapsing star than a living organism. I needed to talk to someone. My first stop was the chief engineer's workshop. The air here was sharp with ozone and metallic tang, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of the volcanic cave system. He was hunched over a sputtering conduit, his face smudged with grease, a wrench clutched in one hand. Sparks occasionally showered from his work. "Chief," I began, trying to keep my voice even, "I need to discuss the specimen. Its growth rate is unprecedented." He grunted, not looking up. "Tell me about it, Reid. The power draw for your section alone is spiking. What's it doing, trying to consume the entire outpost?" He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I stepped closer, gesturing with my hands. "It's more than just the growth, Chief. It's the way it's growing, the patterns, and I've been experiencing a resonance, a kind of directed energy, almost like a communication, but not with words." He finally straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze tired but kind. "Reid, I've seen your reports. The plant is certainly a marvel, never seen anything like it. But this resonance you're talking about, you've been cooped up in that humid chamber for weeks. The isolation, the constant low-level stress of a new species. It can play tricks on the mind, son. We all get a little stir-crazy out here." He patted my shoulder, a gesture of paternal concern that felt like a dismissive wave. "Take a break, get some sleep, let the automatic systems handle it for a few cycles." The words, though well-intentioned, landed like stones in my gut. He hadn't heard me, not really. He saw a tired xenobotanist, not a man experiencing the genesis of something utterly alien within his own skull. Frustration tightening my chest, I sought out the communications specialist next. He was in the comms hub, surrounded by the soft hum of data relays and the distant, rhythmic clicking of telemetry. Her eyes, usually bright with curiosity, were focused on a scrolling display of orbital trajectories. "I need your input on something if you have a moment," I said, trying a different tack. "The non-terrestrial flora, I've been documenting its growth and the patterns are becoming geometric. Impossible geometries, actually. And I believe it's emitting a low-frequency, non-auditory signal, something that interacts directly with neural pathways." She turned, her brow furrowed. Geometric like a fractal. We've seen some strange organic structures before, but impossible geometries is a strong claim, Reid. And a neural signal. What kind of sensor are you using for that? My own perception, I admitted, feeling the weakness of the argument even as I voiced it. It's not something measurable with our current equipment. It's a feeling, a directed mental pressure. It started subtly, but it's escalating. She leaned back in her chair, a sigh escaping her lips. Reid, I respect your work, truly. This plant is fascinating, but you're describing subjective phenomena. Our instruments, even the most sensitive bioscanners, show nothing of the sort. Your brain, under prolonged exposure to an alien environment and extreme isolation, might be interpreting background noise or even simple bioelectrical fluctuations as something more significant. It's a known psychological effect in deep space research. She offered a sympathetic smile, but it felt like a barrier, reinforcing the chasm between my reality and theirs. Perhaps you should log a few cycles away from the specimen. Get some fresh air in the habitat modules. The air in the habitat modules was recycled and sterile, a pale imitation of the natural world. It wouldn't clear the hum from my head. Their logic, their dismissive concern, only served to amplify the terrible truth. I was alone in this. Back in the research section, within the simulated volcanic cave system, the plant pulsed with an almost triumphant glow. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alive. It was growing not just in the humid air of its engineered habitat, but within the very confines of my mind, finding purchase where no one else dared to look. The outpost, once a sanctuary of scientific exploration, now felt like a cage, and I, its sole, unwilling audience. Not just the plant, Anya. I pressed, my voice tight with frustration. I'm having experiences, hallucinations, dreams of a foggy village so real I can taste the damp earth. Finally met my gaze, her eyes filled with a weary sympathy. Reid, I've been practically living in that lab. Sleep deprivation, isolation. It does things to a person. I'm a brilliant xenobotanist, but even the best minds can crack under this pressure. Perhaps a mandatory rest period is in order. Later that day, I tried to speak with the detective, catching him near the comms station. The plant is doing something to my mind, I stated, foregoing any pleasantries. It's not just a specimen, it's an intelligence. It's showing me things, making me perceive things that aren't real. The detective, a man whose face was perpetually etched with a calm skepticism, simply raised an eyebrow. Blake, I've seen men crack out here. The void does that. Over-identifying with my research. It's a plant. A fascinating one, no doubt, but still just a plant. He paused, then added, if I continue to report these hallucinations, I'll have to log it, and that might mean a forced evacuation for psychological evaluation. Their dismissals were a cold blade, severing my last ties to shared reality. They saw a scientist unraveling, not a man perceiving a truth too vast for their understanding. The isolation deepened, not just from the cosmos, but from my own kind. And in the corners of my vision, the edges of the sterile metal walls seemed to blur, softening, taking on the texture of ancient, damp stone. The faint scent of wood smoke, once confined to my dreams, now seemed to drift through the ventilation system. The unraveling was complete. My lab, once a bastion of scientific rigor, had become the recycled air of the habitat modules, did nothing to clear the persistent hum from my head. Their logic, their dismissive concern, only served to sharpen my focus, to hone a desperate resolve. The outpost, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit, now felt like a sterile cage, its pristine surfaces reflecting a reality that was no longer mine. The corridors stretched longer, colder, the very geometry of the place seeming to shift subtly at the periphery of my vision. The plant specimen, it was the source. I knew it with a certainty that transcended mere data. Every twitch in my vision, every phantom scent of ozone and decay, every whisper that brushed against the edges of my hearing, it all emanated from that impossible flora. I retreated to my lab, the hum intensifying as I neared the containment unit. Its tendrils, once confined, now seemed to pulse, a faint, alien light throbbing beneath the frosted glass. My research logs, a meticulous chronology of the specimen's impossible growth, offered a desperate clue. The initial geological survey that had led to its discovery mentioned a volcanic cave system, a network of subsurface fissures and chambers deep beneath the outpost. It was a place of raw, untamed energy, where the planet's molten heart bled into the rock. Perhaps, I reasoned, the plant's properties were intrinsically linked to that environment. Perhaps, in its birthplace, I could find a way to nullify its influence, or, at the very least, understand the true extent of its reach. I gathered what I needed, a portable energy projector, its beam designed for mineral extraction, and a heavy-duty environmental scanner. My movements were precise, fueled by a singular, burning determination. The journey to the access tunnel for the volcanic cave system was a blur of flickering lights and echoing footsteps. Each step felt heavier, as if the very air itself was thickening, pressing in. The hum in my head had become a low thrum, a resonant frequency that vibrated through my bones. I felt less like a scientist on an expedition, and more like a condemned man walking towards an inevitable confrontation. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of minerals, and the acrid bite of sulfur as I descended into the volcanic cave system. The outpost's sterile white gave way to a world of jagged obsidian and glowing fissures, where molten rock pulsed like a slow, arterial beat. My environmental scanner flickered wildly, its readouts a chaotic mess of unknown energy signatures. Deep within a cavern where the air vibrated with latent power, I found it not the main specimen, but a secondary growth. A patch of the same impossible flora, clinging to a wall of cooling basalt, its fibers intertwining with the rock as if born from it. It was smaller, less developed, but undeniably the same entity. This was my chance. If I could destroy this lesser manifestation, perhaps I could sever the link, disrupt its psychic tendrils. I calibrated the energy projector, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. A focused beam of concentrated heat and light erupted from the device, striking the alien growth. The rock hissed, steam billowed, and the plant's fibers glowed with an unnerving intensity. But it didn't burn. It didn't wither. Instead, as the beam enveloped it, the plant seemed to absorb the energy. Its tendrils pulsed brighter, the faint alien light within them intensifying, spreading. And then it happened. A shockwave, not of sound or force, but of pure sensation, slammed into my mind. The hum in my head exploded into a cacophony of impossible frequencies, a choir of silent screams and alien joy. I dropped the projector, my knees buckling. The volcanic cave system twisted around me, the glowing fissures becoming monstrous, unblinking eyes. The basalt walls rippled like flesh, and the very air seemed to coalesce into shifting, formless entities that pressed in, watching. It wasn't merely absorbing the energy, it was processing it. The plant wasn't just growing around me, not just influencing my perceptions from a distance. It was within me. It had interwoven itself with the very fabric of my mind, a psychic parasite reshaping my consciousness from the inside out. My attempts to destroy it hadn't weakened it, they had fed it. The energy I'd directed at it had been absorbed, processed, and then amplified, turning my own attack into a conduit for its deeper penetration. They were a chorus, a symphony of alien intelligence, and I finally understood their terrifying message. It wasn't about destruction, it was about redefinition. It sought to unravel existence by unraveling the sanity of those who perceived it. And I, Reid Blake, was its primary host, a living canvas for its ultimate expression. The volcanic cave system pulsed with this new, terrifying understanding, its ancient stone walls now a part of the plant's vast, living consciousness. I was trapped not by the rock, but by the burgeoning horror blooming within my own skull. The outpost, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit, now felt like a sterile cage, its pristine surfaces reflecting back a distorted image of myself, a man pushed to the very edge of comprehension. I moved with purpose, the soles of my boots slapping against the polished deck plating. The communications array, a bank of blinking lights and humming consoles, felt like my last tether to a sanity I could trust. If I could just get through, if I could just articulate what was happening, perhaps the distortion would lift. I initiated the long-range hailing sequence, the familiar chirp and whine of the signal processor a faint comfort. I watched the display, the green bars climbing, indicating a link establishing. A crackle, then a rush of static filled my ears. I adjusted the frequency, fiddled with the gain, more static. This is Outpost Serenity, I repeat, Outpost Serenity to Earth Command. I spoke into the comms unit, my voice tight, an edge of desperation I couldn't quite suppress. Priority Alpha message. Seeking immediate contact. This is Reid Blake, xenobotanist. A burst of sound erupted from the speakers, not words, but a cacophony of disjointed noises. A child's laughter, impossibly clear, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the console. Then, a voice, deep and resonant, not speaking English, not speaking any language I knew, but uttering sounds that seemed to rearrange the very air in the room, forming new, terrifying patterns in my mind. It wasn't just nonsensical, it was anti-sensical, designed to dismantle meaning itself. I slammed my fist on the console. What in the hell is that? A colleague, the lead engineer, rounded the corner, his expression a mask of practiced calm. "Having trouble, Reid?" His eyes, usually a warm hazel, seemed to shimmer with an unusual flatness like polished stones. "Trouble. The comms are broadcasting. Madness, did I hear that?" Gestured wildly at the console. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on the blank screen where the signal bars had vanished. "Sounds like a standard atmospheric interference pattern, Reid. Nothing unusual." He turned a dial, the static softening to a gentle hiss. "Probably just a solar flare. We'll try again in a few hours." Standard? That was not standard. That was a voice. I insisted, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. A voice that shouldn't exist. His lips, thin and bloodless, stretched into a faint, unsettling smile. "Everything exists, Reid. It just needs to be perceived." He patted my shoulder, a touch that felt strangely cold, and then drifted away, his movements too fluid, too effortless for a man of his build. His casual dismissal, the unsettling calm in his eyes, sent a chill through me far deeper than any technical malfunction. Was he hearing something different? Or was I hearing something that only existed for me? The plant's influence, I realized with a sickening lurch, might not be confined to my personal perception alone. What if it was like a contagion, subtle and unseen, reshaping the minds of everyone on the outpost, twisting their reality just enough to make them compliant, or worse, make my reality seem aberrant? My isolation deepened, became a physical weight. I had to know, I had to go back to the source. The plant. The impossible specimen in the volcanic cave system. It was the only constant, the only thing that had initiated this unraveling. If the world was twisting, then the root of the twist must hold the answer. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint metallic tang of minerals. The path became uneven, twisting downwards, the artificial lights giving way to the glow of emergency strips, then nothing but the beam of my helmet lamp. The hum in my head intensified, synchronizing with a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very rock around me. As I descended further into the winding passageways, the stone walls began to subtly shift in my peripheral vision. I saw faces in the fissures, eyes in the crystalline formations, all of them watching, all of them silent. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming pressure of a presence that was too vast, too ancient to fully grasp. Finally, the tunnel opened into the cavern. The air here was warm and moist, thick with the earthy sweet scent of the plant. My helmet lamp cut through the gloom, revealing the colossal cavern, a geological maw carved by millennia of volcanic activity. And there it was at the heart of the chamber, bathed in its own faint, pulsing luminescence. The flora specimen, but it was different, vastly different. It had grown, of course, that was to be expected. But the tendrils, once merely sinuous, now writhed with an impossible internal light, like veins filled with living starlight. Its surface, once a uniform, impossible green, now pulsed with every color imaginable, each hue bleeding into the next, forming intricate dynamic mandalas that seemed to draw the eye deeper and deeper into their patterns. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a plant. It was a tapestry woven from perception itself. And then I saw it. Amidst the swirling colors, within the very structure of the plant's impossible fibers were patterns that shifted and coalesced. Not just abstract shapes, but forms. Forms that twisted and reformed like a cosmic alphabet being written and rewritten in real time. And I recognized them. They were the distorted faces of my colleagues, their expressions serene, their eyes the flat, polished stones I had seen in the engineer's face. And among them, woven into the very fabric of the plant, were the symbols I had seen on the comms, the chaotic geometric patterns, the child's laughter, the guttural growl, all made manifest, frozen in an eternal, shimmering loop. The plant wasn't merely influencing my perceptions. It was absorbing and rebroadcasting reality, filtering it through its own alien consciousness. The static on the comms, the flat eyes of my colleague, the growing sense of unreality, it was all part of the plant's unfolding narrative. It wasn't driving me insane. It was showing me the true nature of sanity, or rather the lack of it, the utter malleability of everything I had ever believed to be real. The plant was not an object to be studied. It was a lens, a filter, a living projector that was slowly, patiently redefining existence itself, one perception at a time. And I was standing at the focal point, watching as my world, my mind, and everything I understood was being meticulously, beautifully, and utterly unmade.